Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. The subject of today's episode is significant as he is the first person covered on the podcast never to actively seek political office. Nevertheless, his influence on the politics of his country was profound for many decades, so much so that that country's politics cannot be understood properly without examining his life and legacy. Solomon Mujuru was the commander of the Zimbabwean Defence Forces from 1981 until 1992, after leading Zimbabwe's pro-independence forces in the long war for black self-governance in the 1970s. A fierce, resourceful individual, it seems possible that Mujuru was the only person in Zimbabwe with the clout to challenge the country's leader, Robert Mugabe. Indeed, my guest goes as far to say that Mugabe might not have been able to govern the country in the authoritarian way that he did without Solomon Mujuru. However, their relationship soured as Mugabe's presidency progressed, culminating in Mujuru's mysterious death in 2011. Mujuru's position in the shadows of Zimbabwean politics makes him a highly contested figure, and my guest's book, The Army and Politics in Zimbabwe, has helped to shed light on this enigmatic man. My guest today is Miles Tendi, author and associate professor in African politics at the University of Oxford. We discuss what made Mujuru such a successful revolutionary fighter, his time training in Bulgaria and the Soviet Union, and how military leaders interact with politicians. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Solomon Mujuru. Hello, Miles. How are you?
How are you doing, Tom? I'm fine, thank you.
Great. You very kindly sent me, Miles, a copy of your book, The Army and Politics in Zimbabwe. It's about our subject today, Solomon Mujuru, something of a Zimbabwean legend, really. I've read bits of the book, and it's a really great exposition of how kind of revolutionary movements work and how politicians interact with armed forces, the armed forces that the politicians are relying on to take control of the country and keep control of the country. Why did you decide to write this book about Solomon Mujuru?
Thanks for having me on your show, Tom. It's a real honor. I should have said that at the start. Why did I start writing this? I guess the story begins, I am a scholar of civil-military relations, and I've always been interested in Zimbabwe particularly. One, because it's fascinating in its own right, in the sense that here you have two liberation armies, two armies that fought for independence, one called ZANLA, one called ZIPRA, that fought an independence war against a colonial Rhodesian army. There is no decisive winner. So in 1980, independent Zimbabwe, the British Army then comes in via a unit called BMAT to basically try to integrate these three undefeated armies and form one single national army. You tell me how that works out. Well, we'll get into the details of all that, but that's what kind of drew me in. It's just a fascinating place to think about civil military relations, where you have these rival traditions. And what's fascinating too, the colonial Rhodesian army was modeled a lot along the lines of the British Army. ZANLA, which the subject of this podcast Mujuru belonged to, was basically trying to adopt tenets of guerrilla warfare from China, from Mao Zedong. And ZIPRA, the third element, was basically a pretty conventional, mostly Soviet-trained army. So very different traditions, and you try to bring them together. So it was about thinking about that. That was really the fascinating bit. But in the process of researching civil military relations in this context, this man, Solomon Mujuru, subject of our podcast, kept coming up. His role, actually, because he's the first black commander of this national army in independent Zimbabwe. So the integration is largely led by him. So clearly, a founding military figure, if you will, his values, outlook, perspective on civil military relations was going to be particularly significant in this context. And he kept coming up in interviews. You've got to talk to Mujuru. A lot of this was Mujuru's doing. In the end, I thought the best thing to do was to tell his story. But in trying to tell his story, I think one thing that then solidified that was his death. He dies in 2011 in a strange house fire. In the book, I argue it was actually a political assassination. But just at about the time that he died, I was basically hot on his heels and literally just missed it. I think the manner of the death actually solidifies or reinforces my conviction to tell the story. So that's how I kind of came to it.
Okay. Well, there's lots of stuff we're going to get into there over the next 45 minutes. If we look at the early life, Miles, Mujuru was born in 1945, and same year as the end of the Second World War, in southern Rhodesia, which was a colony still at the time of his birth of the United Kingdom. And you write in the book that Mujuru's mother had a very difficult birth with Solomon. You write, Solomon's trying birth was perhaps an intimation of his coming troubled childhood. Can you go into some of the things that made Mujuru's childhood and teenage years very hard?
Yeah, difficult birth. And I think, as I say, as you rightly point out, it really became a marker for what came. Because not long after, Mujuru is still only 3 years old, his mom passes away. And so do a number of his siblings, some strange affliction. It was a long time ago. They didn't really have proper health services, so we don't know what caused these deaths. But what makes it particularly difficult is the role of his father, Neverson Mujuru. He was a particularly distant parent, and in some ways quite brutal as well in the way he thought about discipline and in managing family relations. So because of that, at some point that neglect, Mujuru is a bit sickly at the time, is rather unwell, and for a child who's about that age, 3, you should be talking. He's not talking, and then when he begins to talk, rather late, he has a pronounced stutter. And his father, basically thinking that he will probably die anyway, sends him away to go live with his sister. And then when he arrives to live with his sister takes care of him for a while, but then he's then moved to another uncle. So it's a very nomadic childhood that he experiences. No real attachment to his father. Mom dies at the age of 3. If you lose your mom at the age of 3, you're not going to really have any strong memory of her. So yeah, he's a chap who nomadic, sickly childhood, and this inability to talk in a particular way. So tough life. Plus, I think the context of all of that is the poverty. This is a rural area, place called Chikomba in Zimbabwe, really poor, marginal, and it's a colonial period where black Africans such as him really had little opportunity in that context because they had the wrong skin color.
Indeed, southern Rhodesia had, as the British African colonies went, a fairly large white minority. The Western African colonies, for instance, didn't have a particularly entrenched white minority, whereas in southern Africa, where it was cooler, where white skin was perhaps not as vulnerable to the sun, there was a larger white minority. I think from what you've said, you can draw a line, perhaps, over psychoanalyzing, you can sort of draw a line between his childhood and the shrewd, resourceful leader that he came to be. I recently released an episode about Jacob Zuma, who, of course, was detained when he was young for anti-colonial, anti-government activities. And this was also the case with Mujuru, right?
Yes, and I think the bit you talk about the context turning into a shrewd individual, what it really does, and what you're speaking to here is this neglect, being tossed around from family member to family member, sickly, pushed around because he didn't feel, couldn't talk well, really teaches him to be independent. You gotta fend for yourself, and try by all means to make the best of your situation. And you see that throughout his life. This is a man who always strikes out his own path and really overcomes the most difficult odds. And that childhood, the way I write about it in the book, he probably shouldn't have lived through that childhood because of the poverty, the poor health, the neglect, but he somehow makes it. And you see that survival streak playing out through his teenage years, during the war itself, and for a long time in the independence period. However, his luck does run out in 2011 when he dies in that suspicious house fire. I call it political assassination. Yeah.
When he was young, in this sort of early 60s, when racial tensions and political tensions in Zimbabwe were really beginning to reach a boiling point, a point of no return, was Mujuru political? Was he a kind of leftist in the African National Congress anti-colonial tradition that was taking off in Africa at the time?
This is not a deeply ideological man of limited education. It doesn't really go beyond 6 years maximum of formal schooling. Not to say that formal education is the only thing that makes you deeply ideologically informed, but he was not that kind of man. I think this talk about the independence, making the best of what you can in a difficult situation, also makes him very practical. And to him, in that practical sense, what's partly denying him opportunity, right, is the colonial order. And to defeat the colonial order, we have to take up arms. And this is him practical, a hands-on, can-do approach. That's him. So in his mind, participating in a armed struggle is the means through which the country achieves independence. And then opportunity for people such as him and others is then created. So think of him as very much about man, say, just in pursuit of freedom. He's not particularly leftist, if you want to call it that. This is not a man who was steeped in that kind of world. He has a very practical outlook on politics, life, day-to-day matters. That's how Mujuru lives.
The Zimbabwean War of Liberation began when Mujuru was 19, started in 1964. I think it's important at this point to kind of make a distinction between different groups, and you mentioned them at the start in your first answer to me. You have the Zimbabwe African National Union, which is ZANU, you have Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, and you have various military organizations that are linked to those. What were the operative differences between ZANU and ZAPU as kind of anti-colonial political movements? Which one did Mujuru kind of associate himself with?
The big difference, I think, what you would have to say is ZAPU is kind of came first. Is in many ways the godmother or godfather. ZAPU became for ZANU, which then creates ZANLA, the armed wing that Mujuru later belongs to, was basically a splinter party. There were differences around about 1963 between the two over strategy, over how best to approach the struggle for independence. And ZANU breaks away from ZAPU, and they become pretty much rivals from that time through to the independence period. Mujuru starts off as ZAPU, because in large part because when he strikes out, to try to make a living, he does so in Bulawayo, which is a major industrial hub in southern Rhodesia, that should just say, at the time, in the 1960s. He goes to seek employment there. And ZAPU is really big in that part of the country. It's a ZAPU stronghold. And he wants to be part of the anti-colonial struggle. At that time, you could only be ZAPU in Bulawayo. But not just Bulawayo. ZAPU at the time was very much a national party. So everywhere, ZAPU was the thing. ZANU was very much a small splinter group that happened. So he's a member of ZAPU and gets his initial military training, as a ZAPU soldier. goes off to Bulgaria, goes off to Russia as well. It is only much later on there were differences, divisions in ZAPU. This is the early 70s that he decides to defect to join ZANU. And that's where he really carves out his name, is in ZANU. Not so much ZAPU, but the foundational training. You have to credit that to ZAPU in many ways.
What was his experience of going to Bulgaria and the Soviet Union? And this must have been a very odd experience for him, probably a very fruitful one, but an odd one to go from a country like Zimbabwe, worlds apart from Bulgaria and the Soviet Union.
I go back to the earlier point about him being a very practical individual. So remember, when this is all playing out, this is the Cold War period. And one would think, hey, this guy's gone to the Soviet Union, he's gone to Bulgaria. He must be, East communist. That's what he must be steeped in. Not at all. Very practical. To him, it was, I am going to get military training. So sometimes, we struggles in Africa, whether of independence or civil wars, we often tend to map Cold War politics onto them. This side was East, this side was West. No, Africans had a lot of agency. They derived what they needed to basically meet their particular agendas in the context of this Cold War struggle. So yes, it looks like it's the East helping out an African nation to achieve independence from a colonial or imperial West. But for people like Mujuru, these people can give me training, the training I need to go back to fight a war. That's how he really approached that time abroad. So in interviews that he gave, for instance, there is nothing in there about him, say, waxing lyrical about, meeting the Russian leadership or what communism looked about in Russia, looked like in Russia, collectivization or anything like that. No, it is I went there, did this training, came home. So, that's how I would look at it. But obviously, from a social point of view, in the sort, a major culture shock. Remember, this is what I'm talking about. His background, it would have been a major culture shock to be in that part of the world at that time. But I think he does well over there because he's, like I said, the practical element, really committed to the struggle. So I think he trains well. And those skills he acquires, particularly in Bulgaria, really make him stand out when he joins ZANU, when he defects to ZANU in the 1970s. Because ZANU in the 1970s, the time that he arrives, doesn't really have any soldiers with that kind of level of training. So people like him, and it's not just him, it's chaps such as Thomas Nari, Dakarai Badza, who he defects with to ZANU, are really much better trained than any of the ZANU soldiers that they have at the time. And they really help to build up their army, which is ZANLA, from the 1970s onward. So I would think of him as a very practical man, and his time abroad in these countries in a very instrumental sense. This is a man thinking about liberating his country, not big Cold War questions. But we tend to map Cold War politics onto it. But these Africans, really, they're canny. They were using Cold War players as much as Cold War players thought they were using them.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And I think that transactional approach, but also transnational transactional approach, comes across very much in the book. I think the War of Liberation is so long, it's 15 years long, it's difficult to kind of make general claims about it. It feels as if that's the case. In the 60s, how successful was the attempt by guerrilla forces to fight against the Rhodesian government? I'm tempted to say not particularly successful just by virtue of the fact that the war continued until 1979. Can you shed a bit of light on that?
No, you're absolutely, you're spot on there. It was a process of trial and error. 60s, they're literally still learning how do you run a war. And the Rhodesians at the time are way ahead. They have a proper army, intelligence services, the police. They have a proper structure. It's a very, very effective state. And partly goes back to the point you made about having a high white or European settler population. They were there to stay, the settler population. So they really built up effective state structures, particularly as well the repressive ones, because they wanted to maintain their dominance in that context. So for the liberation fighters, it's really difficult. They're still learning. They're often getting killed. There's a high kill rate. Trial and error. They really, really, really get better from, I'd say, 1973 onwards. Particularly sticking to Mujuru on the Zanla side, they really start to become more effective from 1973 onward. So it takes a long time. And even then, there's still this trial and error thing. But still, alongside that, I should also mention, because it's one thing to emphasize how effective the colonial Rhodesian state was in those early years, 70s, that begins to be challenged significantly. But one thing that I also try to underline in the book is the degree to which the war, particularly for the liberation movements or armies, had a pattern of stops and starts. And this had to do with internal divisions. Remember before I mentioned the reason Mujuru defects from Zimbabwe in the first instance in the late 70s was all these internal problems that Zimbabwe had at the time, and decides to move over to a rival liberation army or party. There were constant internal divisions in Zanla, in Zimbabwe, in Zipra, in Zanu, that caused all kinds of splits. And when these ructions happened, so for example, in Zanu, which he joins in the late 70s, in 1975, the chairman of the party gets assassinated. A bomb explodes underneath his car. We still don't know who really did that hit to this day. That was 1975. And it basically results in Zanu's war pretty much grinding to a halt. So I think this too, the stops and starts, because of these internal divisions, some of them entirely generated by internal grievances, others a result to a degree, not entirely, but to a degree also, the influence of infiltration by the Rhodesians themselves, also helped to slow down progress. This is why the war drags on and on for many years.
So post 73 then, and by the sounds of it, more so post 75, what do Mujuru and the people round him do to kind of try and turn the tide of this war, permanently and unmistakably in favour of the Zanla military organisation and in favour of the anti-colonial side?
I think there's the point I was trying to make earlier about the trial and error. In the 60s, they often deployed. But I'll talk more about Zanla and Zanu without any proper reconnaissance. It could be 10, 15 soldiers go out, they get killed. What Mujuru and others, Thomas Nari, Baza, try to do from the 1970s is emphasize the fact that no, we shouldn't just deploy fighters out anymore and try to fight a very effective Rhodesian army. What we need to do first up is one, stockpile weapons in Rhodesia, and they're operating from Zambia initially and then Mozambique later. So move arms in, bury them, stockpile them for later, and also emphasize recruitment. We need to build up proper armies. So from those early 70s side, what begins to turn the tide actually is building up the army, recruitment and training, stockpiling weapons on the other side in Rhodesia. So I think it was a lot about that the recruitment, and that took time. This is where the guerrilla element came in. People such as him basically embedded themselves in rural communities, particularly in the northeast of Rhodesia. He spent months pretending to be an ordinary subsistence farmer, when what he was doing really was trying to talk young people into joining the struggle. So I think that's what really begins to turn the tide. It's building up the armies and stockpiling the weapons on the other side. They get the training, and this builds the basis for a stronger push later in the 70s.
Somebody we haven't mentioned directly yet is Robert Mugabe. And Mugabe was released from prison in 1974. He'd been in prison for nearly 10 years. To some extent, I was expecting this podcast almost to be as much about Mugabe as Mujuru, really, because Mugabe's become so omnipotent in Zimbabwe's history. And I think you mentioned early on in your book that you wanted to kind of break from that a bit, and you didn't want this to just be a reiteration of Mugabe's leadership of Zimbabwe. What I want to clarify, though, is, was Mugabe's leadership of ZANU-PF always as absolute as it became after Zimbabwe became independent? Or was the perception of him being kind of in absolute control constructed after he'd already come to power? Was his leadership of ZANU-PF kind of preordained and inevitable in some sense? Or did he actually have to struggle to lead this movement?
That's a fascinating question. I knew Robert Mugabe was going to come up at some point. And as I do say in the book, I'm trying to get away from that. But in many ways, too, Mujuru's story is entwined with that of Mugabe's. Robert Mugabe goes out. He's in detention for a long time, up to about 10, 11 years. And eventually, in the 70s, he goes over to Mozambique, where ZANU and its Liberation Army, ZANU, are based, to take up the leadership of the movement following the death of the chairman, Herbert Chitepwa, I just referred to, who had been assassinated in 1975. But when he goes over there, he arrives, and what ZANU essentially is, at the point that Mugabe arrives, is an army. And here is this Mugabe, untrained, he's in the sense an untrained soldier, nationalist politician. His real vocation is as a teacher. And they kind of don't accept him for that reason. He's not one of them. And they're suspicious of nationalist politicians because these young fighters, believe that these nationalist politicians have been the source of many divisions in the past. But what also strengthens this view is actually the perception of Mozambique itself, the Mozambique government, Frelimo, which is led by Samora Machel. Coming back to your point about this all being transnational. Mozambique was hosting ZANU and ZANU in Mozambique from 1975, and Machel is also deeply suspicious of politicians. He sees himself as a soldier. He believes the way to liberate Zimbabwe, right, is via young soldiers, not these politicians who squabble and cause divisions all the time. So Machel basically, when he hears that Mugabe is in Mozambique, has him under house arrest, basically, in a part of Mozambique that's by the seaside, to keep him away from the fighters. But it is people like Mujuru who see certain qualities in Mugabe, who begin to smuggle him from the place of his so-called house arrest to the camps to meet the fighters. And it is figures such as Mujuru who in the end work to actually purge other fighters in the Liberation Army who do not want to accept Robert Mugabe's leadership. And I guess this is when we talk about controversy, why Mujuru is so controversial in the political history of Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe would not have attained the leadership of ZANU were it not for Mujuru's influence. Whatever these purges, his manipulation of other fighters, and he's moved to persuade Samora Machel, who was leading Frelimo and the Mozambican government at the time, to accept the leadership of Mugabe. So in many ways, those who were critical of Mujuru to always point out that, look, Mugabe's leadership was disastrous for Zimbabwe post-independence. Who made Mugabe's leadership possible in the first place? Some Mujuru. And as I reveal in the book, he did this in part, not entirely, because they were actually related. This was uncle and nephew. They kept it secret. But Mujuru also, this is not just the only reason, he also saw other things in Mugabe. I talked before about him having a limited education. So one of the things Michelle is actually saying to him is, why do you want to have Mugabe take over the leadership of ZANU and ZANU? Why don't you do it? And one Mujuru's retort is, I am of limited education. Mugabe is a teacher, for God's sake. His level of to a good level of education. So he also talks well. I have this stutter. He can go to international conferences, negotiate peace, be a politician. I do not have that at all. So it's all these number of things, in addition to them being related. Mujuru pushes for Mugabe to take the leadership of ZANU. And those who see him as having a controversial figure in the period of the political history of Zimbabwe will say, this is the man who gave us Robert Mugabe. And last thing I'll say to that, what's that I'll say to that before I let you come in, it then comes full circle in the sense that by round about 1993, they're on bad terms for a range of reasons. And Mujuru becomes the champion of succession politics in ZANU.
Okay.
And it ends 2011 with this fight.
I just want to ask you about something there, though. On so many of these episodes, when I'm talking about people, it becomes very obvious that these people have real hubris and they have amazing self-belief. From what you just said about Mujuru saying that he didn't think he'd be a good politician, he wouldn't be able to go to international conferences, he has this stutter, he doesn't speak well, that's a surprising level of humility, almost.
Agreed. And I do emphasize that in the book. Humility level, it's this ability to recognize one's shortcomings. He was always keenly aware of that. I can't do this and this and this. So politically, that's why he never tries to lead ZANU himself, even though he was the commander at the time that Mugabe came over to Mozambique. He could have easily said, Mugabe, no. We the fighters are going to lead the struggle, and I'm the commander. I will be the leader, military and politician rolled into one. But again, he's keen to recognize his limitations. What I really am is a soldier. I'm a practical person. I know how to go out into the field and operate. I know I don't have the qualities to be an effective political leader. So he does that. But even in the army itself, as I read about in the book, in the independence period, there's that fascinating phase of integration. This lack of formal education, right, comes back to haunt him in a sense. In the sense that the national army they're trying to build is a conventional one. It's the British Army that's coming over to try to build an army that basically, an integrated army that looks like the British Army. And he doesn't have that level of training or level of formal education, right, to lead such an army. What he then does, what he's very effective at, is delegating. So he quickly moves from early independence years to identify highly capable young officers, recommends them for training at top British Academy, Staff College, Camberley, RCDS, and once they come back, these are the people he puts in the key command units and to basically run institutions such as the Staff College, where you're churning out top officers. So I think that ability to delegate is what gets him through.
So this is after 1980, correct? Yeah, after the Lancaster House Agreement.
This is after 1980, but from the 70s, he was very clear that politically, that's how he saw himself. He didn't have the qualities that made for a great political leader. So I talked before about how he's no longer on good terms with Mugabe and is leading the fight for succession in the ruling party. Once again, he's not saying Mugabe step down and let me, who is the most decorated ZANU soldier from the war, become the president. He's actually recommending other people. And there's a pattern. Once again, they're eloquent, young, educated. the same things that Mugabe was back in the 70s. And he's seeing the same things now in figures such as Simbarashe Makoni, in figures such as Sydney Sekeramai. That's kind of Mujuru's makeup.
After Mugabe became president, it's kind of known, and you've mentioned it, that Mugabe became more authoritarian, more tyrannical. I think in the early years, certainly, there was actually quite a lot of optimism that in Britain that this man had taken over the country. He was seen actually as quite a reliable partner, which perhaps is reflected in the fact that the British Army came to train the new Zimbabwean army. As things progressed, why did Mujuru and Mugabe why did their relationship begin to sour?
I think the succession issue was very important to Mujuru. Mujuru becomes head of the army early 80s. 1992 he retires. And even at the time that he retired in 1992, for about 4 years before that, he had been talking about wanting to retire. So this is someone who, in his mindset, believes in moving on to do other things, giving other individuals opportunity. This is how institutions are best function, renewed. If there's a cycle of the people who actually run them, change. Mugabe doesn't see things that way. Mugabe wants to hang on. So when they're disagreeing from the early 90s, it's Mujuru basically saying, I've left the army. You're still head of state. Don't you think it's yours? It's time you step down and gave somebody else an opportunity. So succession is a real issue. And Mujuru never succeeds. As you know, Mugabe actually only ever leaves power in 2017 via a military coup. This is not a man who was about to let go. So that's a fundamental disagreement between them. And I think the second thing, I think that also mattered greatly to Mujuru, is when he retires from the army in 1992, he had been up to this before anyway. He was increasingly involved in business, going into business. Farming, safari enterprises, thinking about mining ventures. But after 1992, when he retires, this is full time. But the problem for him post 1992 is the Zimbabwean economy soon begins to run into a lot of trouble. Round about from 1997, when there's major currency devaluation, the seizure of the white-owned farms post-2000 really undermines the agricultural economy. So for a range of reasons, the economy is not doing well. And for people like Mujuru, who were in business at the time, they're seeing very much the source of these economic problems being embodied in Mugabe's leadership. So part of his argument to Mugabe is, look, you've run the economy ground, and there are also all kinds of sanctions on you and individuals such as us, because we belong to the ruling party, we're being isolated, for the sanctions to be removed, for the economy to pick up, investors to come back, Zimbabwe not to get this negative light in international news, international business, right? You have to step down. So there's that economic or political economy dimension to that as well. So I could go on if you want me to. The range of reasons why they fall out. One last thing I'll say, I think also is the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the late 90s. Zimbabwe intervenes in that war in the DRC to basically assist the leader at the time, Laurent Kabila. So it's countries such as Zimbabwe, Angola, and Namibia on one side, supporting the DRC government, and on the other side, rebels backed by the likes of Rwanda and Uganda. And Mujuru thinks that war is a mistake. One, because costly to the economy. Two, because he didn't think it was winnable. The terrain was completely different to anything the Zimbabwean army had ever operated in. There were language differences, and it wasn't clear to him what the exact benefits to the country were. So there are a range of reasons, policy-wise, around succession, and the real sense that he had become a businessman, and his businesses were not doing well. and he sees the source of this problem being Robert Mugabe. So they fall out massively.
Do you think Mugabe respected Mujuru, or do you think he was scared of him?
I think both. There was a respect, particularly for his role in the struggle and his management of the integration of the army in the 80s. So I think he respected him in that sense, depended on him. I did interview Robert Mugabe for the book. He said precisely these things, that when it came to military affairs, the person he absolutely depended on was Mujuru. Mugabe was very forthright about that. What he didn't say, though, was the fear and animosity. He didn't talk about that. But that came through in interviews with a range of other people. So he's particularly the post early 90s period, when Mujuru is now pushing for succession. Mugabe wants to hang on. He's very concerned about Mujuru's various activities to try to get Mugabe out of power. So he has him under surveillance. And I think I won't mention any names, but somebody I interviewed about politics in the president's office at the time, saying to me that whenever intelligence reports came to Mugabe, the thing he was most interested to hear was, what is Solomon Mujuru up to? And if there was nothing on Solomon Mujuru in those reports, Mugabe didn't bother to read them. He wasn't too interested. He was really concerned about what Mujuru was up to. And so I think it's a mix of both. The fortune for I think Robert Mugabe with regards to Mujuru is the fundamental falling out happens when Mujuru is no longer army commander, when he's retired. Had the animosity, the degree of animosity that you see happening post-retirement played out when Mujuru was still head of the army, I think the fear would have even been greater. He'd have been very paranoid about something such as a coup. Although, as I point out in the book, I very much doubt that Mujuru would have staged a coup had they fallen out that degree when he was still army commander.
Because he didn't care about politics enough?
Again, going back to the way his convictions, his beliefs of what a soldier should do, he didn't believe that a soldier should lead the state.
Sure, but he wouldn't have had to have led the country afterwards, right? He could have just put somebody else.
I think he might have used his standing as army commander to put pressure on Mugabe, but this would have been done all privately. But it would not have been a coup in the way that you saw in 2017. He did not believe an army should play that kind of role, where an army begins to actually dictate politics proper, to take the lead. He always felt it should be in the background. So I think there would have been some kind of pressure from him, but not in that overt way. He would have sought to work through the party, not what happened in 2017.
We haven't got very long left, Miles. So I just want to skip forward to talking about the events of 2011. We've alluded to them a few times. Mujuru died in 2011, and
that's what people always ask me about, and that's the chapter that people who've read the book often start with. But go ahead. I'm glad you asked me about this last. Hats off to you.
So, in terms of these are very odd circumstances that he dies in. He died officially in a house fire, but I've read all sorts of weird goings on the day of his death. Can you go into the events of August the 15th, 2011, as you understand them?
Yes, there is an inquest opened subsequent to the death, and we are then told that this man entered his house, and there are theories about because there was a power cut at the time, that a candle tipped over, and he basically was burnt to pretty much reduced to bones as a result of that fire that started after a candle dropped through some kind of material that started the fire. As you can see, I'm struggling to make the case for the state here. But what I try to do in that final chapter of the book, Fireborn 2, is basically to tear the state's version to shreds. And I'll just throw out a few things. There's a theory about this candle, but the lady who took care of his property points out that she did put out a tiny candle for him on that night, but there was no lighter, so he couldn't even have lighted that candle. She just put out a candle, but they didn't put out a lighter. And Mujuru had long since quit smoking, so could not have possibly have had a lighter on him as well. And the other thing to say also is where he's found. When he's found, it's basically bones, but he's basically found in a hallway on the floor. And what's fascinating is he's found in a hallway on the floor. This hallway, there's a Moroccan rug, and he's atop that Moroccan rug. The Moroccan rug is not burnt at all. So it's basically stained with blood and other juices from the body as the body was burning, but it is unburnt. So it leads you to ask, how does somebody lying on a rug burn all the way to bones, and the rug itself, nothing happens? Fire should be coming from underneath. Right? Why is the fire on top of him? How does a body sustain such a forceful fire that reduces it? Points to some kind of substance that was applied to his body, and also we want to think when fire forensic folks investigate sources of fire, you look for seats of fire. There are 3 seats of fire in there: the living room, Mujuru's body, and the bedroom. When a fire is natural, there's only 1 seat of fire, and then the fire spreads from there. When there are more than 1 seat of fire, that points to arson. So that didn't make sense. Then, of course, as I read about in the book, is the way that the so-called autopsy is done. Basically, there is no proper autopsy done. It's fudged. I don't know if your audience, to try to make this all relatable, if they found time to watch Oliver Stone's recent documentary on the Kennedy assassination. I remember watching that a few months ago and going, oh my God, it sounds, lo and behold, exactly like what happened with Mujuru, when the state is covering up, when things suddenly don't add up. So there's no proper autopsy. The inquest is basically a sham. It's clear this was a political assassination, and it can be traced back to his difficulties with Robert Mugabe at the time. But as I try to intimate in the book, without pointing a direct finger, and I won't point a direct finger as well here, although the buck stops with Robert Mugabe, it's other certain individuals around Mugabe who pushed for the assassination. I can't say who they are. I don't say so in the book, and I won't say so here. But those who read the book very closely can figure it out who precisely these individuals are, who made the case that this man had to be eliminated. And Mugabe still was the boss. He would have given the wink. But it's a particular group of people who I refer to as the deep state in the book, who push for this. But I want to go back to Zimbabwe. I want to be a free man. I won't name names, but those who read the book can make out who these individuals are.
Is that your term, Miles? Deep state?
Not at all. I mean, it's derived from the politics of the Middle East.
I just have one more question for you, Miles, before we finish. I just want to, when you look at Zimbabwe's post-independence trajectory, and when you look at how important these two men were, but in very different ways, and the ways that they had very different skills and could pull different levers, was this a regime constructed by politicians with the help of army officers? Or was it a regime constructed by army officers like Mujuru with the help of politicians?
I think it's always been both, a combination of both. But one also wants to think about, it's a combination of both. One also wants to think about how in this combination, power shifted. I think for a long time when Mujuru was head of the army, in helping to integrate the building this new national army, that's a process of state making as well. So the army figures very much take the lead in that. But in the broader political sense, because of his outlook, he believed, what he called that the party should lead the gun. The politicians were pretty much in charge. Mugabe was in charge. But what we see over time, particularly when a certain figure called Constantino Chiwenga becomes head of the army from around about 2003, over time we see an increasing erosion of Mugabe's authority. He's still in charge for a long time, but the fall was coming, so to speak, and the fruition is the coup in 2017. At that point, I think you do see the military step ahead. But even then, that was 5 years ago, I think the politicians have reasserted their control in many ways under the leadership of Mnangagwa, neutralizing or marginalizing the army since the coup. So I think it's always been a combination of both, but where the power lies has shifted across time. But I would say that in the majority of the time, particularly in the independence period, the politicians, the party, Mugabe, were very much in charge for the majority of the time.
Miles, thank you. I've really enjoyed that. Where can people find the book?
Yeah, it's the paperback just came out actually. What was available before was this very expensive hardback by Cambridge Press, which is like £80, insane. But the paperback just came out, I think, literally 3 weeks ago. I think it's as little as £20, if £20 is little in this context. Amazon is the place to go. I think that's the easiest. If you search on Amazon, the Army and Politics in Zimbabwe, Mujuru, the Liberation Fighter, and Kingmaker, you'll find it on there.
It's great. I haven't read all of it yet, but I do want to finish it because it's just a really interesting analysis into somebody that is not well known in Europe.
I'm glad you picked on that. You got that completely. That was partly one of the aims of the goal of the book. The Zimbabwean story became very personalized, reduced the figure of Mugabe, and a lot of commentators, those who look at it, thought about it through the lens of Mugabe. And what I'm trying to show in this book is what you're getting to is it's much other players, and they're much more complicated than that. And one of them is Mujuru, but was very much in the shadows, unknown about. And I'd like to think I have brought him out of the shadows. And if we're to think about Zimbabwean political and military history, we have to think about his role, his influence in all of that in serious ways, and move beyond Robert Mugabe.
Thank you, Miles.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.